Afternoon. My name is Ann Billisbach, and I'd like to welcome you to the Nebraska State Historical Society's Brown Bag Lecture Series, which are held in room 303 on the third floor of the City County Building on the third Thursday of every month. This is a new facility for us that we're utilizing while our museum is undergoing renovation. You'll find that address and information, as well as a detailed schedule for the series, on our website at nebraskahistory.org. Before I introduce today's speakers, I'd like to thank the Nebraska State Historical Society Foundation. They fund the filming of these lectures for us, and their financial support allows us to tape and then broadcast the programs on public access television station here in Lincoln, and also on our website, YouTube. So if you miss part of this program or any of the other programs, you have a chance to see it in another format. Special funding for today's program is graciously provided by Foundation trustee Mary Ann May Pumphrey. And today's presentation is about orphan train riders in Nebraska, and it's going to feature several speakers who have direct connections with this intriguing chapter in our history. Linda Hein, who's a former Nebraska State Historical Society staff member. She was curator at the Senator George W. Norris State Historic Site in McCook for many years, and then she was a reference assistant curator in our reference room for the library archives here in Lincoln for a number of years. She's going to be sort of the master of ceremonies for this program, and she will make introductions of the rest of the speakers as we go along. So join me in welcoming Linda.
Thank you, Ann. New York City, 1850. It was not a good place for children. In fact, it was a cruel place to be a child. It was estimated that approximately 10,000 children, vagrant children, were on the streets. The death of a mother or a father made it very, very difficult for the surviving spouse to support the family. Many orphans ended up on the streets. For the welfare of the children, a parent would surrender a child or sometimes a whole family of children to the orphanages. These organizations were absolutely overwhelmed. For these children to have a chance to grow up with a family, they had to relocate them. There were two main organizations that brought orphan children out to find homes west of New York City. One was the Children's Aid Society, formed in 1853 by Charles Brace. It was his form of placing out to help both the neglected children of New York City and also to ease the labor shortage in states to the west. The first orphan train, Society Orphan Train, went to Michigan in 1854, and the last official orphan train ran to Texas in 1929. The Children's Aid Society agents would plan a route. They'd send flyers to towns along the way and arrange for a screening committee in towns where the children might find new homes. The so-called screening committees were the town editor, the doctor, the newspaper editor, as I mentioned, the store owners or teachers. This committee was asked to find suitable homes for the children and also help with the process. Children were taken on trains in groups under the supervision of at least one Western agent to selected stops along the route. Once there, the local opera house usually became the place where they would choose their children or pick up their children. And in some cases, it was a single man or single woman instead of parents, two parents that picked up the children. These agents would have the responsibility for a small group of, like babies, you couldn't take as many, to up to perhaps 30 older children to get them to the train station. They had to arrange for at least 3 changes of clothes. They had to make sure they got their bathroom breaks and they got their meals, and also to calm some of those fears that were going on in those children, much like us today. If they had a train change also, like most of the children who came to Nebraska did have, in Chicago. They would have to make sure that all the children and all their luggage got moved also to the right train. It was quite a responsibility. And the towns where both organizations ran the orphan trains had to be along a railroad line, obviously. People from nearby towns, though, would come to those towns to select their children or to pick up their children if it was prearranged. The second main group responsible for orphan trains that reached Nebraska was the New York Foundling Hospital. One stipulation that they had in their contract was for the new parents to be raising the children in the Catholic faith, and that was a part of their contract. After the Civil War, people were actually abandoning infants in New York City. One of the many places that people would leave these babies was on the doorstep of St. Peter's Convent. The New York Foundling Asylum of the Sisters of Charity in the city of New York was incorporated in October of 1869, and the proposed official opening date for that facility was January 1st, 1870, but by January 1st, the sisters had already received 123 babies. Priests located in towns along the railroad routes of the orphan trains were notified that the foundling home had children in need of homes. The priest would then make an announcement to his congregation and ask for volunteers to take these children in. At that point, the prospective parents could actually request a child with blonde hair and blue eyes, or a girl, or a boy, if they had specific requests so they would fit into their family better. And the priest would pass that information along to the Foundling Hospital of the number of requested children, girls, boys that they needed, the ages. One couple I read about had 5 red-haired little girls, and the father really wanted a boy, so they requested a red-haired boy, and their request was granted, and that little boy grew up to inherit that farm. So he was one lucky little red-haired orphan train rider. And then in 1929, the orphan trains ran their last. By 1930, a social service department was established in New York City in order to provide casework services for unmarried mothers cared for in the shelter. And also they added professionally trained workers to the staff of the boarding and adoption departments. But without those orphan trains coming to Nebraska, we would not have had 2 of our 3 speakers today, so I'm very grateful. Our other 3 presenters, Rosie McGuire drove here from Omaha, and she's the daughter of a little orphan train girl. Lloyd Castner drove from his home in Columbus to be here with us, and he's the son of a young orphan train boy. They will tell you their stories of their families. And then NSHS volunteer and retired librarian Mary Rebenberg will show you the database that we've been working on and putting together and how it works. So with that, I'll introduce Rosie McGuire.
Thank you, Linda. Excuse me, just one moment here. Well, I'm glad to be here because I like to share the story about my mom, Agnes Stander. She was one of these at least 200,000 children that did ride the train. We think maybe the estimate could even be bigger, but a lot of times records at those years were not kept very well. And so it's just a guesstimate. My mom was 2 years old when she came on the train. She doesn't remember much, and she didn't want to talk about her past. In fact, when I was just a senior in high school, just in a casual conversation we were having, she just mentioned, she said that she was born in New York City. She rode on a train, and she came to and was adopted, and she had a very happy childhood. and she had no complaints on her life, and I could tell that she really didn't want to talk anymore about it. At the time, a senior in high school, I said, okay. My grandma and grandpa were my grandma and grandpa, her parents, and I didn't think more about it. I wish now I would have quizzed her and got some more information, but I didn't. And so when she passed away, we were getting her house ready for sale, and I found in a drawer a 4-page letter that she had written to her children that explained some of her feelings, that gave some of the details that she knew about, and then I got very interested in finding if I could find the biological parents and get some genealogy going. I went to several orphan train reunions because I was very much interested in learning more about that. And they encouraged me to write to the New York Foundling Hospital. From now on, I'm just going to say orphanage. It's not such a big word. And they did send me all their records in 2006. These records included her baptism certificates, applications that my grandparents put out, agent visits and comments, all the adoption records, and some letters back and forth. And so it gave me a lot of information. Also, at these orphan train writers' reunions, there were very first-hand information because writers would talk about their experience, and so I gained a lot for that. I would like to get a birth certificate of my mother, and I'm still searching unsuccessfully, but hopefully someday I will get that. Before I talk about my mom, I just want to tell you a story about these two brothers. This is Fred and Howard, and they were 6 and 4 when they came to Osceola, and Fred was taken by the Rebenberg family, and he lived in Clark's. Howard was taken by the Hurd family, and he lived in Stromsburg. And as you can see, 75 years later, they're still at that same tree. Well, Mom always celebrated her birthday on July 8th. All the records that I found from the home says July 9th, 1911. Her mother, when Mom was 3 weeks old, was Margaret Isabel Leo. And the reason I know that name is because she signed a paper giving all her rights to the home to raise her little girl. So Mom lived there for 2 years. And like Linda mentioned, there was lots of babies, and that's what the Sisters of Charity did focus on, was saving the babies. A lot of them were abandoned on the streets, and sometimes police would find them and bring them to the home. Also, right inside the door would be a basket, and if people did not want to be identified, there was a curtain behind the basket, so people could just come in, put the baby down, leave, no questions asked. I think sometimes maybe some mothers, like my mother's mother, might have stopped and said something. I'm not sure. But anyway, the children were taken care of. And sometimes they had names on their, pinned on their blanket. Other times they didn't, or no information. They had to just give them a name. But some mothers did write notes, and some of them were you can hear the sorrow and anguish of a mother writing, saying, I can't take care of this child. Please get her to a new home. Well, this is about 15 years later, and the orphan train had been going quite a while with the Children's Aid Society, and the Sisters of Charity decided to take and use it also, but they kind of modified their procedures to fit their own needs. Like Linda said, they wanted to be found in Catholic homes. But they also did a thing that this indentured contract was made into a 2-page legal contract, and the foster parents would sign that if an agent came and found any kind of abuse, they could just take the child out immediately. And so that was a very good safeguard for the children. Most of the children were prearranged in this home, but I have read books and some of them were not. But that was kind of the majority. I have the application, a copy of the application my grandparents wrote, and they wanted a girl between 2 and 2.5. they wanted dark blue eyes and light curly hair, and this is because they were of German descent. Well, 50% isn't bad. Mom came, she was the right age, but she had brown eyes and auburn hair. But they loved her, they loved their little redhead daughter. I like to show this picture because they're dressed up, ready to go on this baby train, and I can imagine Mom might be one of them. So Mom and 5 others came to Beatrice, and Albert and Rosa McCloskey were there to meet the train, and they sewed the tag number and the name of the parents in the little baby's clothes. One of the other coincidences and connection was that on the same train was a 1-year-old baby named Cecilia, and it went to my grandpa's brother. So his family also adopted a little orphan train rider. I didn't find this out till years later. The other thing in this year is I have contacted some railroad historians that have a service that if you tell them the date and time that an orphan train rider came, that they can take official railroad guides and timetables and map out a route. And as you can see, this went from New York City to Beatrice. It was over 1,300 miles. It was a 55-hour trip. And so you can imagine babies and up to 3-4 years old riding for 55 hours. So this is a picture, this is a picture of my mom. This was taken when she was about 2.5 years old. I love this picture, but one of my friends, when she first saw it, she said, "Oh, what sad eyes." This is their family that she was raised in. Rosa and Albert are standing on the porch. Rosa's parents lived in Beatrice also, so she already had some grandparents. And the lady next to her is Aunt Mary, and she is a sister of my grandma's, and she never married, and so she doted on my mom. Well, Mom said she did have a happy childhood, and that was one of the things she stressed. And she also said from her letter she was very grateful that they did take her to a home and that she ended up being in this home and could grow up being a good person. She did feel different, though. She said she didn't look like the rest of the family. And she thought at that time, though, she wasn't going to worry about it, and she was just going to go on with her life. And Mom was very selective in telling the story. And so I have no idea how many people in Ashland even knew. But I do know, I have been told, when Mom was getting on in years, she did have Alzheimer's, and she was in the nursing home in Ashland. And the staff said, "Well, your mom is so interesting. She's been telling us stories about the orphan train." So I said, "Well, good." Well, Mom lived in Beatrice for 6 years, and then they moved to Lincoln. And when they moved to Lincoln, then they had a baby girl of their own, Margaret. So she had a baby sister to also love. They did file for adoption, and the home there did encourage adoption. And why it took 2 years I thought was kind of interesting. And they didn't start it until she was 18 years old. But I think it had something to do with the paper that the mother signed, and I think it was back and forth with the lawyers and back with the orphanage, and finally in 1932, she became legally adopted. But one thing that was interesting is when her baby sister was born, times were a little different. They didn't have money for a nice photographer and a pretty picture. And this picture that I have in my home is in an oval gold frame, and Mom had it all wrapped up down in the basement. When we sold the house, I didn't even know it existed. So you can imagine my surprise when I unwrapped this and found her picture, so I brought it home. And well, Mom decided that, she would look to the future, even though she thought that orphans at that time were kind of be perceived as not trustworthy, maybe kind of like second-class citizens. And she didn't say anything, but from the different writers, I think children teased the orphans sometimes just because they were different. But she said she was going to go on with her life. She wasn't going to worry about the past. But she did make him comment. She said, "If I have children, I will love my children, and I will show them every day how much they're appreciated." And one of the other things she said in her letter said she wasn't sure why, she didn't know why she was given up, but you can't hate people you don't know, and you can't hate them for whatever reasons if you don't know their reasons. So that was the way she went on with it. One thing, though, that the agency had told her folks, and what this means I'm not sure, but she came from very good blood. So that satisfied Mom. Well, everything is fine. That was it. When I was growing up, that Mom everything is fine. That's kind of what her attitude was. She was very friendly and helpful to others. She was very, though, self-motivated and independent. She was not tolerant of any complainers. Friends of her would complain about this or that, and, she didn't want to hear it. She didn't think anyone should complain. They should just keep on with their life. And she did have the ability to face a difficult situation, which I'll get into in just a moment. Well, 1932, they moved to Ashland, and she met a farmer, Robert Stander, and they became engaged. And everything was going fine, except in October 1934, my dad was changing a truck tire, and the rim blew up, hit him in the head. He kind of flopped up, came back down on the cement. They rushed him to the hospital. He was there about a month, was not expected to live. Well, he did live, but he was blind. So he came home and took about a year to learn how to get around on the farm, learn how to get around in the small town of Ashland. Learned basically a lot of things on his own. And then he went to the School for the Blind in Vinton, Iowa. And there he learned Braille, and he learned some skills for a livelihood. He learned how to cane chairs. He learned how to weave rugs. He learned how to make baskets and several other little small things. And so in December of 1935, he came home. My mom and dad got married in February of 1936. He had a loom where he could do this rug weaving, set it up in their home, and he was in business. Well, I think of Mom and Dad as soulmates, and this is the reason. Like I said, I think Mom could face this adversity very well and accepted it. Dad, I think, was very determined to make a happy life for he and his wife. In fact, when he was in the School for the Blind, and I'm thinking, he's got to be scared and whatever, he was writing encouraging letters to my mom, telling her, that everything was going to be all right, that they were going to make it. He didn't want her to work too hard. I had someone translate a couple Braille letters for me, and I just brought a smile. Well, Dad, when the war came, then he worked at the bomb assembly plant in Meade, and he was the first blind person ever on a assembly line, and he could keep up as well as any sighted person. And since that was such a success, then Milford Trade School after the war would accept him, and he went there to learn auto mechanics. So this was an 18-month course, and he would leave Ashland on a bus, transfer in Lincoln, get to Milford, and he would stay there the whole week, and then he would come home on weekends. Well, where did that leave Mom? 2 children, 2 small children, I was one of them, and the house to take care of. So like I said, I think both of them had perseverance. Both of them could face any kind of situation and make it work. Their first child was a son. He was born in 1937. The first great-granddaughter was born in 1990. Before Mom passed away, she had three great-grandchildren, and one other one now was born in 2003. I like to show this picture of Mom because it does show her auburn hair. It shows her wonderful smile, and that was one of the things she really loved. She wants her family to come home and come for dinner, so she loved to cook and bake. And then I will close with this. I think she did have a happy life. They were married for 50 years. This picture was taken in February of 1986. She had 4 children and 5 grandchildren at that time. And that's the end of my story about Agnes Stander. Thank you.
Thank you, Rosie. And now I'll have Lloyd come tell us about his dad's life.
And show.
In 1853, as Linda's mentioned, Reverend Charles Brace, a 26-year-old congregational minister, joined with other reformers and founded the Children's Aid Society, which my father participated in as an orphan train writer. Reverend Brace was concerned with the growing number of homeless children wandering the streets of New York City. Unlike the other charitable institutions at the time, he provided more than just food, clothing, and a place to sleep. He felt that education and the opportunity to learn a trade were also necessary ingredients to properly care for children. For a short time, he tried helping these children with these existing institutions in New York City, establishing school for them, teaching the boys a trade, inviting volunteer ladies to teach the girls the proper ways to behave and dress, and establishing a saving account to teach children to save their money rather than gamble it away. He soon realized this was not enough and devised a plan for taking orphans from the streets, sending them west on trains, and placing them out to families who were willing to adopt them at various towns along the way. Thousands of children were transferred from overcrowded orphanages in the northeastern United States to live with families or farms throughout the United States. The estimate, there were 4,000 of these youngsters in Nebraska, of which my dad, his 2 brothers, were part of. Shortly before the day of departure with the Children's Aid Society, they were going on the train. They would be told that they're going on the train and off to their own destiny. Upon arrival at one of the projected towns, they would disembark and go to perhaps a local opera house, a local church, or be lined up on a stage or platform at the front of the room. Usually a local town committee had been at work prior to their arrival trying to line up good potential families for expected children. Dad wrote his life story at age 80, and many of these facts come from that writing, but I have done considerable research on his life. My father, Clarence, and his 2 brothers, and his sister Vera were in the orphanage at the time this picture was taken. My dad and his 2 brothers came to Nebraska on the orphan train in 1908. They'd been placed in the orphanage along with their sister Vera, who is in the picture, in an upstate New York community. Their mother died, giving birth to another child. The 4 children were admitted by Ralph Wismer, the superintendent of the poor in that community. Dad remembered the orphanage, which this is a picture of, as a large 3-story building with approximately 40 acres of land. There were other buildings on the property, such as a chicken house, granary, another barn, a cow shed, and a hog house. That's his description in his 1980 writings. The boys, this is also his writing, the boys and girls were kept apart from each other, the boys on one side and the girls on the other side of the building. Every now and then, Dad would go over to the girls' side to see his sister. He could not remember being mistreated in the orphanage. Dad's sister, who was in the picture, and that had to be taken at the orphanage because she never came to Nebraska. The sister was adopted by a family in December 1907 before the 3 brothers left the orphanage in October 1908. The Children's Aid Society assigned a number to each writer, and appropriate files were established for each. Dad's number was volume 46, page 22, number 508, kind of like a Social Security number we're using today. Those files with the number remain in New York City. I've been there on 2 occasions and looked at those files, and some of the pictures you'll enjoy today were taken from those files. The file contained reports, correspondence, photographs, and other information. The boys were then sent to the Brace Family School in Valhalla, New York, for about 4 weeks. These boys were prepared for country life and living. Here's pictures from that farm school, we might call it, and those are not pictures of my dad, but the school provided to me to show you the examples how kids from an orphanage would learn to adapt to a rural life in places like Nebraska. They became familiar with farming, farm animals, and here just having a good time. They remained there about 4 weeks. They left with Miss Anna Laura Hill and 9 other boys and girls for Madison, Nebraska. Miss Hill signed the release for them at the orphanage, was mentioned in the Madison Star-Mail newspaper, so she accompanied the children from the orphanage, apparently to the farm, to Madison, because she was quoted in the Madison paper. The Madison newspaper reported that Miss Hill had 50 previous trips on orphan trains, so that was a full-time job to her, and that was in a 6-year period. Dad wrote at age 80 he did not recall much of the trip to New York City, except that in New York City, a streetcar drawn by a horse collided with a large van as they were being transferred to the railroad station. Dad was 8, Clark was 9, Albert was 5. They had been given a bath, a change of clothing, and a Bible at the Children's Aid Society. The building that they visited still stands in Manhattan. Dad wrote that the children slept in their seats on the train, and the lady in charge was very careful to see that they did not run around. He must have been impressed. In coming through Pennsylvania, Dad looked out the window as they were crossing a deep canyon, and it looked like 1,000 feet down as they went over the trestle. But of course, it was not, but to a child 8 years of age, it was only a world of wonder. Dad wrote that they arrived in Madison on November 12, 1908. They were taken to different homes for meals. Their arrival was preceded by an announcement in the Madison Star-Mail. A wanted poster, home for children. Looks like they were gangsters. And if you had writers on the Children's Aid Society in other towns in Nebraska, your descendant probably had a wanted poster too. And on the bottom it says, tells you when you can pick it up. Here's the committee that was mentioned. And they had 45 sets of parents wanting kids on that day. Another interesting thing about it was, I haven't figured out, and I'm not going to try, but there were 9 kids left the farm school, but there were 14 by the time they got to Madison. So somewhere along the line, they picked up 5 more kids. On November 20th, 1908, as on the poster, 14 children were to be given to anyone that would take them, and there were 45 applicants. The 14 were seated in chairs in a semicircle on the stage of the Madison Opera House. Anyone who wanted a child or 2 could pick them. Miss Bogatis, who joined the group in Omaha, said the children must have a good home, were not to be mistreated, and raised as their own children. She told the audience she would personally check each year to see if everything was going well. This is an article. The next slide is the next week's issue of the Madison Star-Mail. You can buy that today by a subscription. I have 2 issues. And it goes on to a second and third column, lists all the kids that were taken that day, who the parents were, and where they lived. And most were rural situations. Not many stayed right in Madison. They went out on the farm and worked. Good week they had that 4-week training school back in New York. Albert and Dad were chosen by a Mr. and Mrs. John Regal. Their family had grown up and married, so they were middle-aged. The Regals lived and farmed on 160 acres of land 10 miles northwest of Madison. That's what that article said. Dad wrote that a friend sitting there with the Regals in the Opera House heard Mrs. Regal say, "Let's take home those two red-headed boys." And we have a picture of the Regals and the two boys and their dog outside the home of the Regals. And I got that picture from the file in New York City. So somebody sent that picture, either this Miss Bogatis, who was with them frequently, or Dad or Albert sent it to New York. And I'm pleased to have that photograph. Each foster parent signed a statement that they would send the child to school until the child was 14, during the winter months until 16, and retain the child as a member of the family until 18. Should the child prove unsatisfactory, the foster parent would notify the Children's Aid Society. I have a copy of that agreement Mr. Regal signed. 2 children did not find foster parents, and which that article said, and they'll find a place for them in Lincoln. Why Lincoln, I don't know, but recent research that others will get into, the 2 children we found, and they went to a second town, not Madison, but others will talk about the recent research, but they're accounted for in the records. In May 1909, Mary Castner of Geneva, New York, aunt of the boys, contacted the Children's Aid Society attempting to get them, but the boys were already in Nebraska. Representatives of the society kept in contact with the 3 boys and submitted annual visitation reports, many written by Miss Bogatis. And this is the form of it. I kind of refer to it as a report card. We all used to get those in school. Here's a long description of what's going on at the Regal house, both mentioning the parents and the 2 boys. The other is more uniform information. Are they conforming to the rules and that kind of thing? It was a report card on both the parents and the kids. And that happens to be written by Miss Bogatis. And it says, Clarence is a quiet, thoughtful boy and a great contrast to his brother. Mr. and Mrs. Regal are fine people and are very fond of the boys to return their affection. Albert is doing well in school and has a fine hand. So that's a report card that went back to New York, and then 50 or 60 years later, I go pick it up. On August 23rd, 1920, Albert sent a letter to Miss Bogatis asking her to get him a ticket to New York. The society replied that the society would not consider the request. It would seem extraordinary, according to the letter, that after 12 years in that good home and people who took you in and took care of you when you were small and helpless, that you should leave to go back to relatives who never did anything for you. Later that year, Albert went to Sioux City, Iowa with a friend, and the 2 joined the Army. Albert was stationed in the Panama Canal Zone. Following military service, Dad occasionally heard from Albert when Albert was working in Baltimore, Maryland. Albert married but had no children. Albert retired in 1968 after 22 years in the shipping department of a Baltimore furniture store. Clark was taken by the Helms family, who lived 5 miles southwest of Regals. The boys saw each other in that time frame that he was in the Regals and Dad was in the Regals and the Helms had Clark. Visitations were also kept on Clark and the Helms family. The Helms moved to a farm 16.5 miles southwest of Atkinson on December 11th, 1911, 3 years after they were claimed in Norfolk, where Mr. Helms was a laborer in a grain mill. On April 14, 1917, 6 years later, he was involved in a hunting accident. Clark died as a result of that accident in May. My dad attended his funeral. The Castner boys had good homes, and my father was very complimentary of the care they were given by the Regals and the Helms. The Regals provided Dad with a year and a half of education at the University of Nebraska. They asked him to return to Madison since that they were getting feeble and could not care for themselves. Dad then began a career in banking with the Madison National Bank. Dad ended his banking career 33 years later when he retired as executive vice president of the Sydney National Bank in Sydney, Nebraska. When the last of the orphan trains were sent out in 1929, more than 150,000 children had found homes, 4,000 of those in Nebraska. The monitoring system was sketchy, as she reported, so there was no totally accurate records. The vast majority led lives of absolutely ordinary accomplishment and satisfaction. However, many saw no end to the misery into which they were born. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lloyd. We're going to get set up now so you can see the database that Mary's been working on. I started and then I retired, and Mary has carried on like a trooper, and done so much research. You have to be a real detective to find these kids that she's finding. So Mary Rebenberg will explain the program.
In 1977, Eloise Thompson, journalist of the Omaha World-Herald, started soliciting and compiling the names and information on children who came on orphan trains, not just to Nebraska, but to all states. In many cases, the information that was provided by the children themselves, in other cases by relatives or someone who knew these children. Inventories which asked for children's birth names, or also known as names, dates of birth, where they were born, parents, dates came, etc., were filled out with as much detail as was known. These make up the bulk of the records. There are also letters, newspaper articles that are included in these files. In recent years, the Nebraska State Historical Society obtained all these records. Lloyd, Linda, Rosie, and I have been organizing them, emphasizing those records of children who were taken by families in Nebraska. They are filed by Nebraska towns where either the train came with them or where the people who took them lived. To find out more names of children, the arrival dates when the children were brought to various towns were determined. We then searched microfilms of town newspapers around the arrival dates and often found lists of children, often their ages and who took them. Fortunately, this added many children's names who came on the Children's Aid Society trains to our files. Unfortunately, the New York Foundling Hospital seldom publicized the children's names that were sent to the towns. Along the way, federal census lists, internet searches, county histories, books about orphan train children, information from the National Orphan Train Complex, and obituaries were also checked to add more names of children and details. I have been putting this information on a computer database. The number of children so far that I have in the database is 1,365 children. It has 31 categories. Oops, better be careful. And at the top, I think at the top, you can see, this is going to be interesting. You can see it starts out with a birth name, the middle name. Yeah, middle name. I can probably do it. Middle name and adopted name at the beginning. As far as the birth name, a lot of this information came from inventories. Sometimes with the names, especially the birth name and the parent's name later on in this report, came from census records. Sometimes we know the name of the family that took a child, but we wouldn't know the name of the child. So I would try to find the census record, and it would show a child was adopted, and sometimes it would show their birth name, and so that I incorporated that into our database. Sometimes we didn't have any names, so we have NA there right now, and hopefully someday we'll find out the names of the children. The adopted name isn't, to me, always an adopted name. It's the name the child was known by. I feel sometimes the child wasn't actually legally adopted, but this is a name that was used in the family for that child at the time, and later on even the child decided that was their legal name and they would make it so. The gender is pretty self-explanatory. Sometimes we didn't know the gender, though. Sometimes it said a child, and we'd just write UNK for unknown. Birth date, often we have the year. For George, on there, George Mesheri, George Eugene Johnson. I guess we don't have what his date is, but sometimes we have a single year. That often came from a census record, because a census record would usually say about what year the child was born or the year they were born. Then we also have where born. That again is sort of self-explanatory. And then age at arrival, now this isn't always evident from anybody, but it's often, like in the newspaper articles that I mentioned, they would often give the age of the child when they were actually brought to that town. Sending organization, this is when Linda was talking about the Children's Aid Society. If you see CAHS on there, which I think George came, no, he came with the Foundling Hospital. No, yeah. Is that right? It's hard to read this. Oh, he didn't, we don't have anything. Anyway, you'll see, maybe it's easier here. On the end of this line, CAS would be Children's Aid Society. On this case, we have NYFH. Later on, we just go FH for Foundling Hospital. Then it tells when they came. Sometimes, if we know it, we don't always know when they came. Later on, the family who took the child, again in the newspaper articles or in the inventory, they would often, the child or the person who submitted the inventory would give that information. I did have a case where sometimes you knew the name of the parent, but you didn't know the name of the child. So again, I'd go to the census record, and usually you could find a name of the parent. I may be saying it backwards. But anyway, one time I had a name of a parent, Adelson, Addleson, and I could not find that person in the census record, which I thought was strange. I knew they came to Stromsburg, so I put the things together. Come to find out, the name is Adolphson. So I put that information in. Later on, we have an alias. I don't know if it shows up on that screen, but I will have indicated that the name might have been Adelson, so that they can tie those things together if one person has that one bit of information. Where they lived, second family, like we've talked about, children didn't always stay in one place for various reasons. They were passed on to other families. Now, a second family is pretty good sometimes because, so in that case, we'd list the family name. But some children went to as many as 5 different homes. So we would write down a number 5. To find out how many, to find out who they went to and where they went to, you would have to probably get the hold of the town file that this children was listed in, and we'd have that information included if we knew the information. See, then we have this adopted, and yeah, adopted is a Q as adopted, whether they're adopted or not. In some cases, we know that they were adopted. Some cases we don't know. Some cases we know they weren't adopted. I don't always feel when it says they were adopted that they were legally adopted. I sometimes just feel that that's sometimes what the child felt they were, assumed, and later on found they weren't, or it was a kind of a way to indicate what kind of relationship they had with a parent. It wasn't like a birth child in a census record. Then siblings. This, when it says yes, that means they had blood siblings, which many times, as Lloyd has mentioned, came together to, well, Nebraska. They came to other states, too, for that matter. And if you have some indication of that, I tried to indicate, yes, they had birth siblings. If they had stepsisters or stepbrothers, I didn't necessarily indicate that. Then there's a photograph line. Yeah, that's still, no. Yeah, birth mother and birth father, excuse me. That was something that, again, we don't have a lot of times there weren't ways to find that out. Later on, with more research, people have been finding that information, but initially they wouldn't have it. So when you're really going back into the 1885s or whatever, the finding of that is very much more difficult. Then we have, like I said, the siblings, and then a photograph that is again indicated in our files, whether there's something in a book that shows a picture of them, or, for example, if a picture had been given to the Historical Society of those children, this would be, again, something you'd find there. News articles often refer to a newspaper article, either the one like Lloyd showed you, or there may be a interview of the that children had later on in a reunion or something. Then as far as later, okay, I'm not sure, I'm not going to necessarily, it's hard to get all this on here, but there are other database, or excuse me, categories are marriage information. We have not as complete on that. There is some that we don't have on here that I'll be adding as time goes on. We also have alias, and this is where the Adelson would come up, or sometimes a child had a nickname or another discrepancy in spelling of the first name. Anyway, in a few instances, we know that a significant number of children came to a community, but unfortunately, we don't know their names or who took them, only when they arrived and what dates. So I put them in a group arrival. Another thing to be aware of is that the children may have been sent on more than one orphan train to different communities, and the database can be searched by any of the categories, and they can be put those information together. And then I have many children who have no towns and no families, just the names, and it would be wonderful to find out sometime more about those children. The information you see in the database may be the only information we have about the children. However, one should look at the children's files in the orphan train collection, which could include other facts and sources. At this time, the database will be accessible through the reference services of the Nebraska State Historical Society. If any of you know about children who came on orphan trains in their lives, we'd be happy to add them to our list or add the information you might have to records that we may already have on these children. Send this information to Tom Mooney, M-O-N-E-Y, in care of the Nebraska State Historical Society, 1500 R Street, Lincoln, Nebraska, 68501.
Do we have time for questions? Does anyone have questions of any of the presenters? Yes.
I was just wondering, all the children that left New York City on the train, did any child return because they were not?
Yes.
Yes.
I can answer that. That was the case of those two boys. Can you go to the microphone? Oh, sorry. That was the case of those two boys that went and they were in Osceola. And if they could not find a home for Howard, and they found a temporary one for him, but if they could not find a home at all that day, he would have to get back on the train and go back to New York City. And there, in my research, I found there were a lot of times siblings were taken on one town and maybe another sibling not taken until 2-3 states later, or even, maybe that way. And so siblings sometimes did not be able to grow up and know each other. That's why I thought this one was interesting. And the reason I even put it in, when I forgot to mention, Fred Rebenberg lives in Clark's. Well, my daughter-in-law's hometown is Clark's. And I find when I talk, there's all kinds of connections sometimes.
Yes.
Did they go farther west than Nebraska? Did they go clear to California?
No.
Yes.
Okay.
Not to California.
Repeat the question. The question was, did they go farther west than Nebraska? And the answer is yes. In fact, orphan train riders were in all states. I now that I know about the railroad historians, I would like to find a person that went to California to see if we could even track that whole route, because I think that would be interesting. But I know they had said that these riders did go to all, well, at the time, 1910 was the information, and Arizona was not a state. Otherwise, they went to every state.
Yes.
Was the U.S. government involved in any way on some of this stuff, or was it all private?
Mrs. Jacob asked.
The question was the U.S. government involved at all? As far as we know, no. This was, the Children's Aid Society had to raise money to help pay for their care. The Sisters of Charity, I'm sure, took in donations. And so it was all up to those kind of private type things.
And Mary just mentioned too, Mrs. Jacob Astor provided quite a bit of funding for this project too. So we've just got about 1 minute left. Anybody? Yes. Or
Oh, I was wondering about the non-Nebraska children and the database. I know you mentioned that some information had been collected about non-Nebraska children.
Not in the
Who were not placed
Not in
in
the
Nebraska.
Not in the database, though. The non-Nebraska children are not in our database.
But you do have some information.
And there's a National Orphan Train complex down in Kansas, and they would be a little bit more able to answer questions about non-Nebraska children that would be available. Yes.
Did they just, I've always thought they just routinely snatched or grabbed kids from the streets and said, we're taking you to Nebraska, we're gonna take you on an orphan train. I get the impression that these children had places to stay. I mean, this foundling home and stuff like that.
She had heard that children might be snatched from the streets and sent out to Nebraska, but all of them, I think, were put in orphanages or these homes first and then processed through to be on the orphan train. I think we don't have time for another question. We'll answer it after the program, though. But thank you very much.